The fire was almost out when the men stepped inside. Not firefighters, not neighbors, not family. They wore dark coats that still held the night air. Hats low, shoes careful on the soaked floorboards. One of them carried a small notebook, another carried an empty case. They did not look at the body. They looked at the desk. The house still smelled of smoke. An old paper, the dry, tired scent of pages that had been turned more than they had been touched. A lifetime of words lived there, drawers swollen with water, shelves bowed from heat, ink blurred into soft ghosts. One of the men knelt beside a trunk that had split open in the heat. Inside were letters, drafts, pamphlets, margins, crowded with handwriting that grew tighter and sharper with age. The handwriting of someone who did not expect to be given space. He lifted a bundle, weighed it once in his palm, and placed it in the case. No warrant was mentioned, no inventory was offered, no. I said her name. Outside, the stretcher waited under a sheet, already greying with ash. The woman who had lived here for decades lay smaller in death than in rumor. 89 years old. Bones like kindling. Hands that had outlived presidents, wars, fortunes, and factories. She had died in the night, in a fire that started quietly, and finished quickly by morning. The government was inside her home. Not because she had been rich, not because she had been powerful, not because she had ever held office, commanded soldiers, or owned anything worth stealing. They came because of paper, because of words, because, even at 89, they were not entirely sure she was finished. Speaking, long before the fire, long before the city had grown glass towers over its old brick scars. There had been a girl the law did not bother to record. No birth certificate, no official name, no proof she had ever arrived. She entered the world, the way livestock did, counted, not welcomed, assigned value, not identity. Born into a system that measured human beings in labor and resale potential, somewhere in the wide heat of Texas, before the war that would tear the country open, she took her first breath in a place where breathing itself was conditional. History would later argue over her. Origins: Black, Mexican, indigenous, some combination that made officials uncomfortable and storytellers poetic. But the system she was born into did not care about nuance. It cared about use. She was not meant to become visible. She was meant to be absorbed. Children like her grew into fields, kitchens, wash lines. They disappeared into other people's needs. Their lives left impressions like footprints in dry dust, clear for a moment. Then gone with the first wind. The country was expanding. Rail lines pushing west. Cotton moving east. Money thickening in the hands of men who would never learn her name. She was born at the bottom of a structure so large no one inside it could see its full shape. And yet, from the beginning, there was a problem. She watched, not in rebellion, not yet, just watching the way a child studies weather, animals, voices through walls. She learned early that survival belonged to those who noticed patterns, which doors creaked, which moods turned violent, which silences were safe and which were traps. In a world where she owned nothing, observation was a form of private property. When the war came, it did not arrive as liberation. It arrived as confusion. Men left uniforms, appeared. Whispers thickened into rumors. The grown-ups spoke in half-sentences. The rules shifted, but never clearly. Freedom was announced the way storms are announced, loudly, from far away, without instructions for those standing in the rain. One day she was property, The next day, she was something else, not equal, not protected, not safe, just NOWNED. Freedom, in that place, meant being exposed without shelter. The fences fell. But so did the thin obligation former owners had once felt to keep their property alive. Now, survival was unofficial. Now, hunger had no overseer. Now, danger had no schedule. She grew into that uncertainty, the way some trees grow into wind, bent, but rooted. There were no schools waiting for her, no officials eager to document her new status as a person. No ceremonies marking the transition from commodity to citizen. So she made a decision. So small no one noticed at the time. She decided to learn letters. Not in a classroom, not with a teacher, not as a right, as a risk. Reading, for someone like her, was not an accomplishment. It was a quiet trespass into a world that had not invited her. Every word she learned was a door opened without permission. Paper had once been something other. People owned. Now it became something she could enter. The country rebuilt itself. Loudly, railroads, factories, banks, laws written by men who had survived the war with their wealth intact. Speeches about unity floated over cities that smelled like coal smoke and hot metal. In that new America, opportunity existed, the way light exists, under a door, visible, but not meant for everyone. She moved north, eventually, pulled by rumors, the way iron filings are pulled by a magnet. Cities promised anonymity, work, crowds large. Enough to disappear inside. Disappearing had always been a survival skill, but in the city, invisibility worked differently. In the countryside, being unseen kept you alive. In the city, being unseen let you listen. Factories roared from dawn into night. Machines swallowed hands, lungs, childhoods, streets filled with languages from every ocean. People lived stacked on top of each other in brick buildings that sweated in summer and froze in winter. There were so many poor people that poverty itself became background noise. And in that noise, she heard something familiar. Exploitation had changed clothes, but not behavior. Men who called themselves free stood in lines that looked like ownership without paperwork. Children traded school for shifts beside gears taller than they were. Women stitched garments they would never wear for wages that dissolved before rent was due. The country had ended. Slavery in name. It had industrialized it in practice. She did not shout this. Not yet. She watched. She found rooms where people gathered after work, not to rest but to talk. The air thick with tobacco and fatigue. Newspapers passed hand to hand until the print blurred. Arguments that began about wages and ended about the structure of the world. She listened more than she spoke. People underestimated quiet women, especially poor ones, especially those whose past could not be easily traced. Underestimation is a form of cover. She learned the language of power, the way she had once learned letters, by entering a space not designed for her and refusing to leave. Words like capital, labor, state, ownership stopped being abstractions and started mapping onto faces she knew. Injuries she had seen, funerals she had walked past. She began to write. Not beautifully, not delicately, precisely. Her sentences did not wander. They moved like someone crossing a yard where dogs were known to be loose, direct, alert, unwilling to linger. Editors printed her work because it cut clean, because it said aloud what others softened, because it carried the authority of someone who had lived at the bottom and did not find the view. Romanta readers did not know who she had been as a child. They only knew the voice on the page did not ask permission. By the time the authorities noticed her, she was no longer young. But she was not loud either, and that confused them. Agitators, in the official imagination, were supposed to be reckless men with visible anger. Easy to point at, easy to arrest, easy to explain. She was methodical. She spoke without raising her voice. She did not perform rage. She described systems. She did not threaten. She observed outcomes, an observation, when accurate, is difficult to argue with. Police officers attended meetings where she spoke and wrote reports that sounded irritated rather than alarmed. She did not incite riots. She did not carry weapons. She did not call for blood. She did something more destabilizing. She made exploitation sound ordinarily routine, predictable, and therefore not inevitable. Factories depended on the belief that suffering was natural, that long hours and short lives were simply the cost of progress. She spoke as if these conditions were choices made by specific people with names and addresses. That was new. That was dangerous. Years passed. Movements rose and fractured. Leaders were jailed, deported, discredited, replaced. She remained not at the center, not in headlines, but present, a constant variable in an equation the country kept trying to solve by force. She aged without softening. Time did not make her gentler, it made her clearer. The longer she lived, the less patience she had for illusions that had already failed. Once before, she buried friends, buried causes, buried the hope that justice would arrive quickly or cleanly. But she did not stop. Governments prefer enemies they can defeat. They do not know what to do with people who simply persist. So they opened. Files thin at first, then thicker. Clippings, transcripts, notes from informants who described meetings in basements and rented halls. Her name underlined. Her movements logged. Not because she commanded armies, because she endured. Decades later, when her hair had gone white and her steps had slowed, young officers reading those files would ask older ones why the department still bothered. "She's nearly 80, they would say. "She speaks to a few dozen people at a time." The older men would shrug. Ideas they had learned that not obeyed the body that carried them. Sometimes the most durable threats came wrapped in the least impressive packages, a thin woman with a stack of papers, a voice worn but steady, a history that refused to stay buried. So they watched through wars, through depressions, through administrations that changed slogans but kept the same fears. They watched until the night her house burned, back in the ruins, as morning pushed a grey light through broken windows. The men finished filling their case. One of them hesitated over a final stack, pages curled from heat, edges blackened, handwriting tight. Disciplined to the end, he did not read them. He did not need to. He had been told what they were. Evidence of a life spent describing the machinery of power from underneath it. He closed the case. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Streetcars clattered, factories whistled, people hurried to jobs that would replace them if they stumbled. No flags lowered, no headlines paused. An old woman had died in a poor neighborhood. That was all most people would ever hear. But in a government office, a new box would be added to a shelf. Her words would sit in the dark, labeled, archived, contained, not destroyed, just buried where fewer people would think to look. Erasure, when done carefully, does not leave a stain. It leaves silence, and silence over time, begins to feel like the natural state of things. Before, there was a voice. There was a schedule. Morning arrived, not with sunlight, but with sound. Boots on stairwells, carts rattling over stone, a whistle far off, thin as a blade. In the boarding houses, people woke already tired, their dreams still threaded with the rhythm of machines. In the neighborhoods where rent was cheap and air was not, the day did not begin, it resumed. Water was carried up narrow flight in dented pails. Bread was divided by eye, not by measurement. Shirts were turned inside out to hide yesterday's stains. Children learnt early how to lace boots, quickly and speak little. No one called it survival, they called it life. The city had been built to move goods, not people. Streets angled toward rail yards and river docks. Smoke settled low, as if the sky itself were tired. Buildings leaned toward one another, brick shoulders touching, holding in heat, smells, arguments. Factories did not sleep. They inhaled workers at dawn and exhaled them after dark, marked by grease, lint, metal dust. The noise inside them erased. Conversation. You learned to communicate with gestures, with glances, with the timing of your breath between clanks. Time was not measured in hours, it was measured in shifts. If you were late, the door closed. If you were injured, you were replaced. If you complained, you were remembered. Remembered not by name, but by category. Trouble. In rooms above, bakeries, and beside slaughterhouses, people from everywhere learned the same arithmetic. Wages minus rent minus food minus coal minus debt. The sum was always smaller than the effort. Women stitched in windows, where light lasted longest. Men coughed into rags they washed at night and folded again in the morning. Children ran errands through streets slick with runoff, learning the map of saloons, pawnshops, and relief offices before they could write their own names. No one used the word system, but everyone moved inside one. She entered this world without announcement. No parade, no introduction, just another woman renting a narrow room, paying in coins, counted twice. She kept her belongings small enough to carry if needed, a trunk, a stack of papers tied with twine, dresses chosen for durability, not display. Neighbors learned her habits before they learned her story. She left early, returned late, walked with purpose but not haste, nodded when greeted, listened when spoken to, offered help without asking questions. In crowded places, she took the chair near the wall, a position from which she could see the door. The rules of the neighborhood were not written, but they were strict. Do not draw police attention. Do not discuss politics in front of strangers. Do not assume kindness from those with clean collars. Do not forget that charity often keeps lists. Information traveled along clotheslines and market stalls, who had been fired, who had been hurt, which factory had cut wages, which landlord had raised rent again. Grief was shared quietly. Anger was folded small and kept in pockets, taken out only among those who understood its weight. She became someone people spoke to when they were ready to say things out loud, not because she was loud, because she was steady. Evenings were the only hours that belonged, briefly, to the workers themselves. After supper, if there was supper, people drifted toward halls above taverns, back rooms, behind print shops, basements, lit by a single hanging bulb. Folding chairs appeared from nowhere. Newspapers in 3 languages lay side by side on scarred tables. The meetings had no banners, just tired faces and the hum of thought. Trying to stay awake, she sat in the second or third row. Never first, never last. When she spoke, she did not begin with outrage. She began with description. How many hours this week? How many fingers lost in that shop since winter? What did they say when you asked for a doctor? Questions, not slogans. She built arguments, the way others built crates, piece by piece. So the weight would hold. Outside those rooms, the city told a different story. Newspapers celebrated expansion. Investors toasted progress in rooms with carpets thick enough to swallow footsteps. Politicians spoke of opportunity while police wagons idled at factory gates during strikes. Prosperity was visible, but not touchable. Windows displayed goods the workers had made but could never afford. Coats stitched by women who owned only shawls. Watchers assembled by men who measured time by whistles. The gap between promise and reality was not hidden, it was normalized. That normalization was the true architecture of the place. She learned the geography of power without ever entering its buildings. Which newspaper editors would print a letter if phrased carefully? Which ward bosses accepted complaints only when elections were near? Which police captains preferred intimidation to arrest? She understood that survival here required the same skill it had required in childhood. Read the room, read the faces, read the silences, so she adjusted. Some nights she spoke plainly. Other nights she asked someone else to speak first, measuring the air before adding her own words. She could be fire or stone, depending on what the moment demanded. Performance, when honest, is still performance. And she became very good at it. In the factories, the pace quickened year by year. New machines arrived that required fewer hands and less training. Skilled workers were replaced by the young, the desperate, the newly arrived. Accidents increased. So did funerals. Widows learned to sew black quickly. Children learned which charities asked too many questions. Priests and preachers offered comfort that did not interfere with payroll. She attended services when invited, head bowed, eyes open. Faith, she knew, was another language people used to survive. But she kept her own language sharp and separate. The law existed in the neighborhood mostly as absence when wages were stolen. There was no office to report it. When landlords locked doors over missed rent, families slept in hallways until relatives took them in. When police entered a home, they did not knock for long. Justice, like fresh air, seemed to thin out before reaching these streets. So people created parallel structures, mutual aid funds, collected coins for burials. Neighbors shared coal. Older children watched younger ones when shifts overlapped. Information about safer workplaces traveled faster than official notices. None of it solved the larger problem, but it kept people alive long enough to keep trying. Her room became a place where letters were written. Not love letters, appeals, petitions, notices to employers, phrased in careful, formal language that carried just enough threat of exposure to be taken seriously. She charged nothing. Payment came in stories, each one a variation on the same design. Work given, body worn down, reward withheld. She stored these stories the way others stored savings quietly, for later use. The city authorities described neighborhoods like this with a single word: disorder. They meant noise, crowding, unfamiliar languages, gatherings that lasted past dark. They did not mean the deeper disorder, a system that required endless labor from people who would never see its rewards. But the surface disorder gave them reason to patrol. Uniforms walked the streets in pairs, batons, visible eyes scanning for gatherings that looked too focused. Meetings were sometimes dispersed on technicalities. Permits denied, howls pressured by landlords to cancel rentals. The message was consistent. Work is allowed. Organization is not. She understood this distinction better than most. It told her exactly where to stand. Winter was the hardest season. Factories slowed, work thinned. Cold entered through walls and stayed in bones. Illness spread in rooms where windows stayed shut to keep heat in. Doctors cost more than rent. She visited the sick when she could, bringing broth, coal, sometimes just conversation. She took notes afterward, not of symptoms, but of causes. Laid off, evicted, overworked before the fever. Patterns, again, always patterns. If you had asked the city's wealthy what threatened stability, they would have pointed to bombs in distant headlines or fiery speeches in crowded squares. They would not have pointed to a woman walking home at dusk with ink on her fingers and a head full of other people's grief. But stability does not erode only through explosions. It erodes when people begin comparing notes, when private suffering becomes public knowledge, when the story told from above no longer matches the story told at the table. She was part of that comparison, a quiet hinge between lives that might otherwise have remained isolated. She rarely spoke of her past, not because it shamed her, because it distracted from the present. The people in those rooms did not need a legend. They needed language for what was happening now. So she kept her history folded away, like a document shown only when necessary. Invisibility, once forced upon her, had become a tool she could choose to use. People heard her words before they saw her fully. And that, in a world trained to dismiss certain faces, was an advantage. By the time officials began attaching her name to reports, she had already been part of the neighborhood's mental furniture for years. Dependable, unimpressed by authority, able to explain complicated things without decoration. She did not promise victory. She described reality. And reality, spoken plainly, has a way of sounding radical in places built on illusion. Nothing about her daily life looked like the making of a threat. She washed clothes in a basin, mended sleeves by lamplight, counted coins before market trips. A life narrow enough to be overlooked. But systems often fail to notice the slow accumulation of pressure beneath them. A pipe does not burst because of one drop. It bursts because the drops never stop. Every meeting attended, every letter written, every worker who left a room, understanding their situation more clearly than when they entered. Drop. The world Deb Mader did not intend to create an opponent. It intended to create labor. Silence. Gratitude for scraps instead. Through neglect and arrogance, it created a witness with a long memory and the patience to wait for the right moment to speak. By the end of this act, the city still believes she is small. The factories still believe they are permanent. The authorities still believe surveillance is the same as control. And she still walks home at night through smoke and lamplight. One more figure among thousands, carrying papers no one important has yet thought to fear. But the routines are in place. Now. The rooms, the networks, the language, the slow recognition that the conditions everyone thought were private are, in fact, shared. The world has built the stage. It does not yet realize who has learned to use it. The first fracture did not look like a revolution. It looked like a slowdown. A machine that had once run without pause began stopping for repairs that never quite fixed the problem. Orders backed up. Supervisors shouted more often. Pay envelopes grew thinner, explanations longer. The newspapers called it adjustment. On the factory floor, it felt like a warning. When production falters, pressure moves downward. Managers lean on foremen. Foremen lean on workers. Workers lean on their bodies until something gives. Something always gives. In the boarding houses, conversations shifted. Not louder, sharper. Men who had once argued about politics in the abstract now argued about missing hours, unexplained deductions, rumors of new machinery that would require fewer hands. Women compared prices at markets and found the numbers rising faster than wages. The gap between effort and survival widened, and gaps, when wide enough, become visible even to those trained not to look. She noticed the change in tone before she noticed the change in numbers. People were no longer just tired, they were calculating. The city's leaders responded with reassurance. Statements about stability, about growth, about the temporary nature of hardship. Charts printed in newspapers showed lines that always seemed to trend upward, though rarely for the people reading them. Factories expanded on paper, while shrinking in practice. Profits were described as necessary for progress. Losses were described as unfortunate, but unavoidable. The language of inevitability returned, polished and confident. She had heard it before, in another context, with different justifications. The structure had changed. The logic had not. Strikes began not as declarations, but as absences. One morning, a line of women at a textile mill did not enter when the whistle blew. They stood outside, shawls tight, hands red from cold, saying little. A supervisor shouted. A policeman took notes. A reporter jotted down numbers. By afternoon, the women were back at their machines. But something had shifted. They had tested the edge. They had learned how it felt to say no. Even briefly, she attended their meeting that night in a room above a grocer's shop. No speeches. Just a careful recounting of what had happened, who had been threatened, which foreman had seemed uncertain. Information gathered, filed. Remembered. Contradictions multiplied. The city celebrated technological advancement, while hospitals filled with men injured by those same machines. Politicians praised law and order, while police broke up gatherings that were, by any plain definition, orderly. New wealth rose in districts with trees and wide streets. New poverty crowded into alleys behind them. The two realities existed side by side, each pretending not to see the other. She began pointing this out, not angrily, but precisely. If the system is fair, she would say quietly in meetings, why does fairness always seem to arrive somewhere else? Questions again. Always questions. Authorities responded the way systems often do, when confronted with calm contradiction. They personalized the problem. Instead of addressing the conditions she described, they focused on the people describing them. Organizers were labeled agitators. Meetings were labeled conspiracies. Newspapers ran stories about outside influences, as if the grievances had not been born inside the factories themselves. Herning began appearing more often in reports, described as persistent, as influential among certain groups, as a woman of unusual ability whose presence at labor gatherings correlated with increased unrest. Correlation, in official language, is often enough. At the same time, divisions appeared within the movement itself. Some argued for patience, for working within the law, for gradual reform, negotiated through recognized channels. Others, younger, less patient, pointed to the length of the workday and the shortness of life expectancy and asked how long gradual change could reasonably take. Meetings grew tense. Voices rose. Accusations of recklessness met. Accusations of cowardice. She moved carefully in these rooms. She did not romanticize confrontation, but she did not mistake delay for wisdom either. Her position, when she offered it, was unsatisfying to both sides. Know the cost, she would say. Whatever you choose, not a call to arms, not a call to caution, a call to clarity. The fracture widened after a series of highly publicized accidents. A boiler explosion in a rail yard. A factory fire that trapped workers behind locked doors. A mine collapse that buried men whose names were known only to their families. Each incident was followed by official condolences and promises of investigation. Investigations that led to reports. Reports that led to recommendations. Recommendations that rarely led to enforcement. Grief began to accumulate faster than patience. Funerals became gatherings, where anger stood close behind sorrow. She attended many of them, standing at the edge, hat in hand, listening. Funerals are places where truth is spoken more plainly than at rallies. There, between hymns, people said what they would not say elsewhere, that their loved ones had not died by accident, but by design, a design that valued output over oxygen. The press tried to contain the narrative. Accidents were described as tragic but isolated. Strikes were described as disruptions to otherwise healthy industries. Organizers were described as dreamers at best, foreign threats at worst. She read these articles carefully, not to argue with them, line by line, but to understand how power wished to be seen. Then, in her own writing, she placed lived experience beside official description and let the contrast speak for itself. She did not accuse, she juxtaposed. The effect was sharper. Police presence at meetings increased, uniforms at the back of halls, plainclothes men pretending to read newspapers near entrances, names taken discreetly, addresses noted. Some people stopped attending out of fear. Others came precisely because of it. Nothing clarifies stakes like surveillance. She did not change. Her routine, predictability, can be its own form of defiance. If they expected her to disappear, she would disappoint them. Economic tension fed political tension. Elections approached, and candidates toured working-class neighborhoods promising reforms, shorter hours, safer conditions, fair wages after elections. Those promises thinned into committees and commissions. Disillusionment deepened. You can only be told to wait. So many times before waiting begins to feel like surrender. In meetings, the language shifted again. Less about appeals, more about leverage. What do workers actually control? When do machines stop? Who keeps records? Who knows the schedules? Practical questions, dangerous ones. She watched younger organizers experiment with tactics she had only read about before. Coordinated slowdowns, boycotts, mass petitions delivered all at once rather than individually. Some efforts failed quickly. Others succeeded just enough to prove success was possible. Each small victory traveled through the city faster than any official notice. Hope, when grounded in evidence, spreads efficiently. Authorities noticed. So did employers. Lists were made. Troublemakers marked. Blacklists circulated quietly between companies. Men and women who had spoken to clearly found themselves unable to find work. Hunger became a tool of discipline. She adjusted again. If open organization was punished, then education had to move sideways. Smaller gatherings, conversations disguised as social visits, articles published under different names, knowledge shared person to person rather than staged to crowd. Invisibility returned as strategy, not retreat. Redirection. Systems built to suppress visible dissent often struggle with quiet diffusion. The contradictions at the heart of the city were no longer abstract. They were daily, undeniable. Factories claimed they could not afford safety measures while paying dividends to distant investors. Police claimed neutrality while escorting strikebreakers through picket lines. Courts claimed fairness while sentencing organizers more harshly than those whose negligence had killed dozens. She did not need to exaggerate. Reality was sufficient. Her role was to keep it from being forgotten between crises. Tension peaked around the demand that had once seemed almost modest, the 8-hour workday. 8 hours for labor, 8 for rest, 8 for living. A division of time that acknowledged workers as human beings, rather than extensions of machinery. Employers called it unrealistic, economists called it disruptive, politicians called it complicated, workers called it necessary. Rallies grew larger, so did the police presence around them. Permits denied were replaced by gatherings that did not request permission. The city felt like a surface stretched tight in the midst of this. She became both more visible and more obscured. Visible to those searching for leadership, obscured by the number of others. Stepping forward, she encouraged that movements that depend on one voice are easy to silence. Movements that speak in many tones are harder to quiet. Still, her reputation grew. Not as a firebrand, as a constant, someone who had been there before the headlines and would likely remain after them. Authorities, reading their reports, began to understand that this steadiness posed a different kind of threat. Not explosive. Erosive. Then came the event that would allow the system to show its hand fully, a gathering, a protest, a moment already tense before anything happened. The details would later be debated, distorted, weaponized, but in the days leading up to it, the city already felt the fracture line running beneath its streets. Workers demanding time, employers demanding control, officials demanding order, each side claiming necessity, each side believing the other unreasonable. She moved through those days with unusual quiet, listening more than speaking, as if she knew that once the break came, the language available afterward would change. Contradictions do not resolve themselves. They intensify until something gives way. By the end of this act, the city stands at that edge. The routines of exploitation have been named. The promises of reform have thinned. The lines between law and force have blurred. And the woman who began as an unnoticed figure in the back of crowded rooms now stands in reports filed in offices she has never entered, described in terms that grow more serious with each passing week. Not because she commands violence, but because she helps people see the structure they are standing inside, and once seen, structures rarely feel as permanent as they once did. Before the explosion, there was rain, a thin, persistent drizzle that turned dust to paste and sound to echo. The streets reflected lamplight in broken streaks. Crowds gathered anyway, coats darkened, hats dripping, breaths visible in the cooling air. They had gathered like this before. To talk, to demand, to be seen. What made this night different was not the size of the crowd, nor the anger in it. It was the attention, watching from the edges, uniformed, mounted, waiting for a reason. She stood toward the side of the square. Not on the wagon that served as a stage, not at the front, where speakers rotated under gaslight. She listened. A speech about ours, a speech about wages, a speech about the right to gather without being treated as an invading army. Nothing new, nothing illegal, nothing that should have required so many police to stand with hands resting on batons. The rain fell harder, as if trying to thin the crowd. It did not work. Power often prefers pretexts to decisions. A moment it can point to later and say, "There. That is why we did what we did." The moment came small. A sound not much louder than a slammed door. A flash swallowed by smoke and rain. Then confusion, the kind that does not spread evenly but in sharp bursts. Shouts. A horse rearing. Gunfire from more than one direction. People running without knowing where safety was. By the time the noise settled, bodies lay on wet stone. Uniforms and workers both. Blood diluted by rain. No one present could say with certainty what had happened first. But certainty was not required. Only plain dot. In the days that followed, the city changed posture. Meetings banned, printing presses raided, homes searched at night, names collected in bad, men taken from beds before dawn. The event was described in headlines as an attack on order itself. The distinction between those who had thrown nothing and those who had thrown something dissolved under the word radical. She watched the sweep begin, knew the pattern. Crisis creates permission. Permission expands. Rights contract. They came for people she knew. Writers, speakers, organizers, who had stood on crates and wagon beds arguing for shorter hours and safer conditions. Some had been present that night, others had been miles away. Presence was no longer the measure. Association was. She visited families left behind, bringing news when she could, silence when she could not. Children asked when fathers were coming home. Wives asked what charges meant. Lawyers spoke in careful language that sounded like hope but felt like delay. The system had shifted from ignoring them to demonstrating power over them. Recognition had arrived. It did not come with respect. It came with handcuffs. Her turn did not come immediately. Instead, she was summoned. An office. A desk. A man who spoke with the smooth politeness of someone confident that the structure behind him would remain standing, regardless of the conversation. He did not accuse her of throwing bombs. He did not need to. He spoke of responsibility, of influence, of how words can inflame unstable minds, of how the city was tired of unrest and looking for cooperation from reasonable voices. Reasonable, a word that meant compliant in that room. He offered nothing tangible, no protection for those already arrested, no guarantee of fair trials, no promise that meetings would be allowed again. Only the suggestion that if she moderated her tone, distanced herself from certain individuals, urged calm rather than critique, life might become easier. It was presented as an opportunity. It was a test. She listened without interruption. She had spent a lifetime being underestimated by men in offices. She knew the value of letting them speak long enough to believe they were being persuasive. he finished. She asked one question. If I do as you say, she asked quietly, what changes for the people whose husbands you have already taken? He shifted in his chair, spoke of legal processes, of unfortunate necessities, of how order must be restored before reforms could be discussed. The familiar sequence: silence first, justice later. She stood, thanked him for his time, left without promising anything outside. The air felt thinner. Recognition, she understood, was not the same as safety. The trials began under heavy guard courtrooms, filled with spectators who had already read the verdict in newspapers. Evidence stretched to cover ideas, speeches quoted as if they were explosives, associations mapped like criminal conspiracies. She attended whenever allowed, sat straight, hands folded, face unreadable. Reporters sketched her in margins, the widow-like figure, the stern woman in black, the female agitator whose presence electrifies sympathizers. They noticed her more now, not because she had changed, because the state had pointed in her direction. Recognition by power is a spotlight with heat. Outside the courtroom, she worked. Petitions circulated, articles written, funds raised for legal defense. Meetings held in smaller rooms, quieter, more careful. She traveled more now, carrying the story of the trial to cities that knew only the headlines. She described procedures, inconsistencies, the way fear had replaced evidence. Not to inspire outrage, to record reality before it hardened into official history. Everywhere she went, police attended, not always visibly, but always. Recognition had extended into surveillance. The offer in the office lingered like a question, with no polite answer. Moderate, distance yourself, encourage, calm. She understood what acceptance would look like. Invitations to speak in safer venues, articles published in mainstream papers with edges sanded down, a reputation as a former radical who had matured into respectability, a smaller audience, a quieter life, fewer funerals attended. It would be a form of rescue from hardship, from danger, from history. She did not take it. Sentences were handed down, severe, final. The system, having framed the narrative, now closed it. Gallows were prepared, appeals filed and denied. The city held its breath in a way that felt less like mourning and more like anticipation. She did not collapse under the weight. She hardened. Grief moved through her like weather through stone, changing the surface, not the structure. She spoke more, not less, but her tone shifted. Less explanation, more witness. She had believed once that if the truth were laid out clearly enough, correction might follow. Now she understood that truth alone does not restrain. Power. Only pressure does. After the executions, her status changed again. Widow. A word that carried sympathy in some circles, suspicion in others. Authorities expected retreat, grief as silencing. Instead, she became more present than ever, traveling, writing, appearing, wherever workers gathered to say that what had happened in that courtroom was not an anomaly but a demonstration. Recognition had stripped away illusion. The state had shown what it would do when challenged. Now everyone could see. Police reports about her grew longer, noting dates, locations, estimated crowd sizes, quoting phrases out of context. speculating about connections that existed mostly in the imagination of those tasked with finding them. She had crossed a threshold, no longer a background figure in labor meetings, now a name in files that moved between departments. Recognition had become documentation. Documentation, a form of containment. And still no rescue came. Not from politicians who quietly agreed with her, but valued their careers more. Not from institutions that spoke of justice, but relied on the same donors as the factories. Not from the press, which preferred scandal to sustained scrutiny. Recognition without rescue is a particular Nabozo kind of isolation, visible enough to be targeted, alone enough to be vulnerable. She accepted that condition the way she had once accepted hunger and cold as part of the landscape, not a reason to stop walking. The system had made its choice. It would respond to demands for dignity with force. It would answer organization with surveillance. It would offer safety only in exchange for silence. Her choice, then, was shaped but still real. She could shrink her voice and be tolerated, or she could continue and be watched. She continued, not dramatically, not defiantly in the way stories like to dramatize, simply by maintaining the same routines that had brought her this far: meetings, articles, travel, conversations in rooms above shops, persistence as refusal. By the end of this act, the illusion that recognition brings protection has dissolved. Power has named her, filed her offered terms. She declined. The path ahead is narrower now, more exposed, but also clearer. She knows the system sees her. She knows it will not save her, and she knows, with the calm of someone who has survived worse forms of erasure, that being seen by power is not the same as being understood. The rescue that was implied was never real. Only the choice was. Age did not remove her from the struggle. It altered her position within it. Younger faces now stood on crates and wagons, voices louder, gestures sharper, language more urgent. Crowds responded to heat. The Times encouraged it. Newspapers preferred fire to patience. She stepped slightly back, not away. Aside. Visibility had become dangerous in predictable ways. Leaders were arrested first. Speakers were banned by name. Halls were denied rental when certain individuals appeared on posters, so she let others take the front and moved where attention was thinner. Invisibility, once imposed, had become a skill. She knew how to enter a room without changing its temperature, how to listen long enough that people forgot she was new, how to ask a question that shifted a conversation without claiming ownership of it. She began spending more time in kitchens than on stages, more time at tables where 10 people sat than in halls where 100 gathered. Ideas traveled differently, in small spaces, more slowly, more deeply. Preparation replaced proclamation. She helped new organizers think through what happened after a speech ended. Who would collect names? Who would follow up? Who would check on the family of the man who volunteered? Too visibly. She mapped networks, the way others mapped rail lines. Who knew a printer willing to work at night? Which neighborhood had a hall whose owner sympathized quietly? Which lawyer could be trusted to show up without advance payment? None of this appeared in headlines. All of it determined whether a movement survived its first confrontation. Her writing changed to less rhetoric, more instruction. Pamphlets that read like manuals rather than manifestos. How to form a reading group, how to document unsafe conditions, how to speak to reporters without giving them what they wanted. She wrote for durability. not applause. Words meant to be used, not admired. Authorities collected these pamphlets when they could. They understood that practical knowledge spreads like roots, unseen until it cracks pavement. She studied the psychology of power, not in books, but in behavior. She noticed which officials blustered and which listened, which police captains preferred spectacle arrests and which preferred quiet intimidation, which judges enjoyed lectures and which hurried proceedings along. This knowledge shaped strategy. Avoid the ones who crave attention. They escalate, approach. The ones who fear embarrassment. They concede quietly. Invisibility allowed observation. Observation allowed precision. Her own life grew smaller on the surface. Fewer public appearances. More time in a modest home whose address was known only to those who needed it. A place where letters arrived in uneven stacks, where visitors knocked at odd hours and left with folded papers in their pockets. To a passerby, it looked like an aging woman's quiet routine. To those who knew, it was a node in a network that stretched across cities. She had become infrastructure. Not the tower, the wiring inside walls. Younger activists sometimes asked why she no longer sought the spotlight she had once occupied. She answered with stories, not instructions, of movements that had collapsed when a single leader fell, of raids that had dismantled organizations whose structures were too visible, of the difference between fame and influence. Be seen when it helps others, she would say. Be unseen when it helps the work. It was not advice that made for posters, it was advice that kept people out of prison. The government's attention did not fade. It shifted tone. Reports now described her as aging but still active. Less a firebrand than a behind-the-scenes influence. Surveillance became less dramatic, more routine. Mal noted. Visitors observed from across the street. Informants planted in groups that might intersect with her. They mistook her quieter presence for diminished importance. Invisibility, again, working in her favor. When power lowers its guard, thinking the threat has softened, it often misses the deeper roots spreading beneath. She trained herself to endure long stretches without recognition. Younger names filled newspapers. New crises captured public attention. She read about movements she had quietly helped shape, as if they had sprung up on their own. She did not correct the record. Credit is visible. Influence can remain hidden. She chose influence. Travel continued, but differently, no longer advertised lectures in large halls. Instead, invitations passed hand to hand. A union local in one city, a reading circle in another, a meeting in a church basement where curtains stayed drawn. She moved like a rumor, hard to track, harder to stop. Everywhere she went, she left behind not just ideas, but structures, contact lists, reading materials, plans for mutual aid funds, strategies for dealing with police questioning. Portable knowledge, harder to confiscate than a printing press. Psychological mastery became as important as logistics. She taught others how to remain calm during interrogation, how to answer questions without volunteering more than required, how to recognize when fear was being used as a tool. Silence, she would say, is not surrender. It is a boundary. Invisibility requires discipline. The urge to be heard must sometimes be resisted for the sake of being effective. This ran against the instincts of youth, but those who listened lasted longer. Her own emotions were managed the same way. She had lost too much to indulge in dramatic displays of grief or anger. Those emotions were real, but she stored them privately, drawing on them as fuel rather than expression. To observers, she seemed unshakable. The truth was simpler. She had learned that systems feed on visible outrage. They use it to justify repression. Calm, persistence, by contrast, gives them less to grab. As decades passed, movements rose that did not know her name. Strikes organized with tactics she had once helped refine. Campaigns for free speech, echoing arguments she had made in rooms long gone. Younger activists debated strategies she had quietly practiced for years. She watched with a mix of distance and recognition. This was the goal, not personal legacy. Continuity, invisibility, ensured that ideas could outlive the person who carried them. Authorities, reviewing their files, sometimes wondered why she remained a line item after so many years. She's old, new officers would note. Her influence must be fading. Older ones would shake their heads. Influence does not always correlate with volume. Some people shape events without appearing at them. Their names surface only in margins. She had become one of those names. Her home filled with paper, letters from workers describing conditions in towns she had never visited, drafts of articles for small newspapers, lists of contacts in cities where unrest simmered quietly. She organized it all with care, not for posterity, for utility. If she were arrested, others would know where to find what they needed. Preparation for disappearance is a form of resilience. She practiced being ordinary, shopping at the same market, chatting about weather with neighbors, attending local events, unrelated to politics, blending into the rhythms of the street. Performance, again. Not deception for personal gain, camouflage for collective. Survival. Systems are less suspicious of those who appear to accept their place. She let them believe she had settled into old age. Meanwhile, the network, HUMMED. Invisibility transformed from defense to weapon. Because she was underestimated, she could move between groups that might have distrusted a more prominent figure. Because she did not seek credit, people shared information freely. Because she appeared harmless, authorities sometimes overlooked her role in coordination. She turned every assumption about her age, gender, background into cover, not to evade responsibility, to extend reach. Time thinned her physically, but sharpened her focus. She no longer wasted energy on arguments that went nowhere. She chose her efforts carefully, investing where structures could be built rather than where applause was loudest. She had seen too many movements flare brightly and vanish. She preferred slow fires, the kind that burn underground, unseen, until conditions change. By the end of this act, she is less visible than at any point in her public life. Fewer headlines, fewer arrests, dramatic confrontations. And yet, her influence runs wider than ever, carried through people who do not always know where their strategies originated. Power still watches, but with less urgency. Mistaking quiet for decline, they do not see that she has shifted from being a figure to being a function, from a voice to a method. Invisibility, once her cage, has become her craft, and through that craft, she ensures that when change comes, slowly, unevenly, imperfectly, it will not have to begin from nothing. By the time the city moved into the third decade of the 20th century, she had become almost myth. Not in newspapers, not in textbooks, not in celebrations. She was myth, because she persisted where others had been erased, because the structures she helped build continued to function quietly, without notice, because systems feared not the flash of her presence, but the cumulative effect of decades spent teaching people to see clearly, act deliberately, and survive collectively. The factories still roared, the streets still choked with smoke and coal dust. The wealth of the city rose in glass towers that cast shadows over the neighborhoods she had walked for nearly half a century. And yet, in those shadows, small networks of knowledge thrived, whispering, planning, organizing, continuing. She moved among them as she always had, calm, deliberate, and unseen by the powerful. She had outlived her husband by more than 50 years. Albert Parsons had been executed after the Haymarket affair, one of the first public spectacles to demonstrate how the state handled inconvenient ideas. She had been present, a witness, a voice of truth, as the gallows closed. The city expected grief to break her. History expected silence. Instead, she acted. For decades, she traversed the country, speaking quietly, advising, guiding, documenting. The press sometimes called her dangerous, sometimes ignored her, sometimes mocked her. Police files tracked her movements, estimated her influence, catalogued her words. The FBI, decades later, would continue this watch, considering her one of the most persistent threats to the social order, not because she wielded weapons, but because she wielded ideas. By the 1930s, she had entered her 80s. Her hair was white, her steps slower, her hands lined with decades of work, writing, and survival. Yet her presence, her meticulous, patient, enduring presence, remained dangerous in the eyes of the state. Not through spectacle, not through bombs or riots, but through the very stubborn persistence of thought, organization, and memory. Even in her final years, she was not celebrated. There were no plaques, no biographies that penetrated public consciousness, only surveillance reports, quietly noting her attendance at small gatherings, the distribution of pamphlets, the subtle instruction of younger activists. March 7, 1942. She died in a fire in her Chicago home. The blaze was not sensationalized in national headlines. It was described as accidental. A loss, yes, but one of many in a city accustomed to death. Hours later, before her body had even cooled, the FBI entered her home. They did not mourn, they did not hesitate. They seized her letters, her manuscripts, her lifetime of careful records, 60 years of writing, correspondence, and observation, everything that could describe her work, the networks she had built, the instructions she had written, the methods she had taught, was collected, catalogued, stored, hidden. The government feared not her physical presence. They feared her intellectual presence, the permanence of her ideas, her influence, her ability to inspire reflection and organization. Even after death, her life had been a study in contradiction. Born into slavery, never legally named, never recorded, denied every institution designed to recognize personhood. And yet, she became a force of social intelligence, a node in a network that outlived the very systems that had tried to erase her. Freedom, she had discovered, was not a destination. It was an ongoing practice of observation, adjustment, and endurance. Survival was not enough. Influence required learning the hidden rules of the powerful and turning invisibility into strength. Her marriage to a man executed by the state had demonstrated another contradiction. Love and partnership existed outside legality. Risk and care were inseparable. Family life and activism intertwined, yet neither was public. Personal grief and public struggle were inseparable. She carried both without flinching. The systems she fought against remained intact. The factories continued. The cities continued. The state continued. Laws remained biased. Inequality remained structured, and wealth remained concentrated. Yet her work endured in ways subtle, quiet, and unrecorded in the narratives the powerful preferred, union leaders she had trained, organizers she had mentored, networks she had helped build continued functioning. Workers' knowledge persisted, advocacy continued. Ideas she had written down, taught, and modeled traveled through time, often without attribution. Victory, in her world, was invisible. It had no monuments, no speeches, no photographs in the papers. She had been underestimated by everyone. Her enemies, her allies, the press, historians. The state assumed that aging would make her compliant, that grief would make her passive, that time would diminish influence. She disproved all of these assumptions. Invisibility had become her tool. Persistence had become her weapon. Ideas had become her legacy. When the FBI seized her writings, they attempted to silence her even in death. But ideas, as she had long known, cannot be confined. The structures she had built, networks, manuals, lessons, passed from hand to hand, were already beyond physical capture. The state had tried to erase her. The newspapers had ignored her. History had delayed recognition. And yet, her influence persisted. Consider the irony. She was a figure feared not for her ability to incite violence, but for her ability to teach thought. The machinery of industry and government could arrest, but they could burn buildings. They could label her dangerous. But they could not erase the knowledge she had imparted. They could not destroy the habit of questioning she had cultivated. They could not stop people from observing, analyzing, and acting quietly, persistently, strategically. Her legacy was one of invisibility, made durable. By the time the mid-century rolled in, younger activists knew her work, though not always her name. They used strategies she had developed. They followed organizational structures she had tested. They communicated with the caution and discipline she had taught. Some remembered stories of the woman who persisted through decades of repression. Some heard rumors of letters confiscated by authorities. Some found manuscripts that had been hidden or copied before seizure. Recognition, if it came at all, arrived decades later, piecemeal, through fragments. Even then, it was sanitized, incomplete. A footnote here, a passing mention there. The state, as always, preferred the visible, the sensational, the violent. It ignored the quiet, patient, strategic. The final lesson was clear. Endurance is invisible. Power fears visibility, but ideas, when nurtured and distributed, transcend it. Influence outlasts fear. Knowledge survives confiscation. Memory can outlive attention. And yet, history has often forgotten her. She had walked the same streets as ordinary people, occupied the same rooms as workers, and shaped movements that spanned decades, and still, her name was absent from most histories. Her work survived without her recognition. Her victories were unseen. Perhaps this is the truest indictment. A life of strategic, patient, deliberate struggle can be rendered invisible by the very systems it confronts. Recognition is not justice. Survival is not victory. Memory is fragile. Her death did not end her influence. Letters, pamphlets, instructions, and networks continued to operate after her absence. Organizers she trained carried her methods across cities and decades. Her insistence on precision, observation, and discipline became a form of immortality. Not celebrated, not widely known, not named. Victory, in the world she shaped, did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived as continuity, as resilience. A small, cumulative resistance that persisted in quiet rooms, workshops, and meetings long after those who opposed her assumed the struggle had ended. The machinery of society had not broken, it had absorbed her. Yet, in absorbing her, it had also been infiltrated, subtly, irreversibly, by ideas that could not be burned, imprisoned, or suppressed. Even now, decades later, the echoes remain. Her life is remembered in fragments, in the tactics of labor, organizing, in the meticulous planning of quiet resistance, in the discipline and patience of movements that outlast immediate crises. Yet her name is rarely spoken. Textbooks overlook her. Streets bear no plaques. Museums display nothing but the surfaces of history. Sanitized and selective, the woman who survived slavery, execution, widowhood, surveillance, and systemic erasure is present only in the structure of things that endured because of her, rather than in the record of things celebrated. The final irony, she who was born property, unrecorded and nameless, shaped history through persistence, discipline, and invisibility. She survived the systems designed to crush her, and yet the world she influenced refused to fully remember her. And in that forgetting, there is clarity. Her story is not heroic in the traditional sense. It does not feature triumph, applause, or monuments. It is a lesson in endurance, in the quiet accumulation of knowledge, in strategic invisibility. The state feared her while she lived. It sought to erase her after she died. And yet, her influence cannot be erased because it exists not in monuments or headlines, but in practice. The house where she died, the papers confiscated, the networks she created, all attest to a life spent resisting the assumptions of invisibility imposed upon her. But the world does not remember her as it should. It remembers only the sparks, the headlines, the accidents, not the slow, deliberate persistence that reshaped lives quietly over decades. Her voice is gone, her name is barely known. But the structures she built, the methods she taught, the lessons she embedded in people all survive. History is full of those who died remembered by few, feared by many, and ignored by most. She is one of them. Victory, in her life, came without recognition. Triumph came without applause. Memory came not for her, but through the people she trained, the ideas she spread, and the structures she helped create. The final truth is this: power fears ideas, but it cannot contain them. Systems fear persistence, but it adapts. The state feared her while she lived, confiscated her papers before her body cooled, and catalogued her life to ensure silence. And yet, she persists. Not in monuments, not in histories written by those who preferred her invisible. She persists in practice, in structure, in quiet influence that continues long after the cameras leave and the files gather dust. History may forget her. The state may have tried to erase her. The world may never celebrate her. But the work she did continues. And in the shadows of that continuation, her legacy remains unseen, uncelebrated, unavoidable, a life erased from memory, but never from consequence, quiet, unsettling, unfinished. She was born property. She died, watched, catalogued, feared, and the world, in the end, neither remembered nor fully understood her. And that is the last word history gives us.